I'm reading Covenant and Polity in Biblical Israel, Biblical Foundations in Jewish Expressions. Volume 1 of the Covenant Tradition and Politics by Daniel J. Eleazar. Sorry. So, beginning in a chapter called Joshua, God's Federal Republic. Deuteronomy completes the 5 books of Moses, the Torah, Israel's basic covenants and constitution. The second section of the Hebrew Bible, Nevim, the prophets, is along with the historical books of Ketuvim, the writings, an account of Israel's effort to apply the Torah as constitution under different circumstances at different times. In a more narrowly political sense, it chronicles and analyzes Israel's search for a workable political regime according to the spirit of the Torah. As such, it is a record of successes and failures, each of which features its own covenants and covenantal dynamics. The political discussions in the former prophets include 6 books: Joshua, Judges, 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, 2 Kings. A close reading suggests that among their other purposes, each reflects and analyzes a particular form of a regime, as understood by the prophets, that is, the Keter Torah of the time. Joshua describes the classic polity envisaged in the Torah, headed by an Eved Adonai, God's prime minister, paralleled by a Kohen Gadol, high priest. The Eved Adonai is responsible for the civil rule of the Edah, the classic Israelite Federal Republic, literally assembly, what is later to become known as the function of the Keter Malkut, the domain, literally crown, of civil rule. And the Kohen Gadol is responsible for linking the people to God, what are later to become known as the function of the Keter Kahuna, the domain of priesthood. Both share the task of interpreting the Torah as constitution. The function of the Keter Torah, the domain of constitutional interpretation. Both leaders function within the framework of a very active tribal federation, in which the tribal leadership plays a vital role. The regime is presented as generally successful and classic in its form. Judges presents the tribal federation in its minimalist state. What happens when the federation becomes a loose confederation and, quote, every man does what is right in his own eyes, end quote. Power has reverted to the tribal elders, assisted by shofetim, judges who led the tribe in battle and administer justice as much as or more than they adjudicate disputes, who share the Keter Malkut. The Keter Kehuna is also handled by local priests and Levites, while the Keter Torah exists principally in the abstract as a fundamental law with no separate institutional mechanism. While tending to a negative evaluation, it offers a mixed picture. By no means all negative. For example, the rejection of monarchy is portrayed as good. On balance, however, confederal anarchism is rejected as a suitable regime. 3. Presented in 1 Samuel is a picture of a prophet-led regime, or at least an attempt to restore the tribal federation by eliminating confederal anarchy through institution of a prophet-led regime. It paints a very dynamic picture of a confederation whose principal federal office was a hereditary priesthood, which is deposed in the period under discussion. The rise of a prophet who was trained with the Keter Kehuna, but shifts to the Keter Torah, and his introduction of a Nagid Malik, High Commissioner, King, reluctantly and out of necessity to head the Keter Malkut, but a subordinate to the prophet. The discussion documents the failure of this regime to stand up to foreign military pressure. 4. In describing David's reign, 2 Samuel presents the classic regime of kingship. The head of the Keter Malkut becomes a king and not just a chief magistrate. He reaffirms the authority of the other 2 Keterim, but also subordinates them by bringing them into his court, and retains the form of a tribal federation, while centralizing power through a standing army and bureaucracy. While this regime is portrayed as successful, its flaws are clearly pointed out as well. 5. portrayed in 1 Kings as a regime of kingship in its ordinary or declining phases. In fact, it contrasts two forms of kingship: dynastic kingship in the regime of Judah and non-dynastic kingship in the regime of Israel, showing the virtues and defects of both. 6. Finally, 2 Kings discusses ordinary dynastic kingship and a political union rather than a federation, its strengths and weaknesses. In addition, 1st and 2nd Chronicles add texture to the historical discussion from the perspective of the Keter Makut of the time. They emphasize political and military affairs, government organization, and the problem of balancing powers and interests. In our examination of David and the establishment of kingship in Israel, it will be useful to keep these perspectives in mind. The Mosaic Covenantal Paradigm in Action. The next step in the process initiated in the Pentateuch is to be found in the book of Joshua, in which Joshua and Israel take the first steps in carrying out the provisions of the Torah as constitution in the newly conquered Eretz Israel. Joshua conquers and divides the land according to the divine plan, with some modifications to reflect the reality of a situation in which Canaanites remain in parts of the land. As a book, Joshua is constructed around 3 high points, each associated with the covenant renewal. 1. The renewal of the covenant with the 2.5 tribes prior to crossing the Jordan and beginning the conquest. 2. The covenant renewal at Shechem, after most of the land is in Israelite hands, followed by the divisions of the land according to the Torah design. 3. The covenant renewal at the time of Joshua's farewell to the people, as the final step in the normalization of Israelite life in the land. Each of these is treated as a central teaching of the book. Beyond its place as a historical work, the book of Joshua should be read as a classic of political thought that can be and should be read as a coherent whole, in fact as a major statement of the classic political worldview of the Bible and the regime it advocated. For political science, it is the first classic exposition of federal republicanism, while the themes it emphasizes are derived from the Torah itself. The Torah combines them with the other elements. In Joshua, the federal republican character of the Israelite Edah under God is the central theme. This writer is fully aware of the theories that see the book of Joshua as little more than a collection of ancient documents or written versions of different oral traditions, some say of questionable historical accuracy. Biblical critics argue on both sides of that question. Regardless of the degree of historical accuracy of those theories on one level, the result in hand is a classic, basically integrated work. Hence, it is also necessary to treat the book as we have it as a unified whole, a work that makes a coherent statement when taken as a whole. In the largest sense, the book of Joshua is concerned with matters far more significant than merely recounting the history of the conquest of the land of Canaan by the Israelite tribes, or even the reconstitution of the conquest within the moral framework of the prophetic school. It goes beyond both purposes to become the embodiment of a particular conception of what a good constitution and a good regime must be, in light of the moral framework of prophetic thought. As such, it addresses the classic issues of constitutional design for Israel as a body politic. A full understanding of the book requires that it be studied utilizing the tools of political analysis. Former prophets and their understanding and underlying political theme. The book of Joshua is the 6th book of the Bible and the first book of the former prophets. It represents a continuation of the account of the history of the Israelite nation after the death of Moses, and is devoted to the description of the conquest of the land of Canaan and its division among the tribes. Any consideration of the book of Joshua must reckon with its place in the order of the biblical narrative and must consider its relationship to the book of Deuteronomy, which precedes it, the book of Judges which immediately follows it, and the book of Samuel, particularly 1 Samuel, which follow after that. Stylistically, the relationship between the first 3 of the aforementioned books is clear. Joshua had been characterized by linguistic analysts as representing a transitional style from that of Deuteronomy to that of Judges. By common reckoning, there are 8 quote-unquote historical books in the Bible. The term historical books is a misnomer, even though the books covered under this designation do appear to relate the history of the Israelite nation from the time of Moses to their restoration to Eretz Israel after the Babylonian exile. Their main purpose is not historical as such. That is to say, their recounting of the historical record is incidental to their major purpose, which is to develop the idea of the Lord's covenant with the Israelite tribes and the tribes' responsibility under it to create a holy commonwealth in their land. An understanding of this characteristic of the Bible eliminates many difficulties. For one, it transforms the historiographic problem of apparent discrepancies, repetitions, and chronological gaps. Since the Bible attempts to be no more than roughly chronological in its sequences, it is not serious to the biblical authors if incidents are slightly out of chronological order. Since the Bible attempts to use cases to teach, it is not serious to the compiler if the same case is repeated in a slightly different version, provided that each version teaches something special. Indeed, what one must look for when one finds the same case repeated is not the fact of the repetition per se, but whether there was not some larger reason for the repetition in light of the Bible's purposes. The covenant idea and prophetic history. The central concern that binds all the historical books together is the prophetic concern with the maintenance of God's covenant with Israel and the working out of the relationship between the Israelites, God and other humans through the covenant. For example, the entire book is permeated with covenant vocabulary, a reflection of the way in which Hebrew rests upon a covenantal vocabulary in matters having to do with relationships. Constitutional considerations are at least as important as the religious and ethical ones in the Bible, and indeed are not separated from them. The books of Joshua, Judges, and 1 Samuel deal with constitutional questions, primarily because the shape of the regime that was to govern the Israel tribes is not yet fixed. The books that follow, beginning with 2 Samuel, continuing with through Kings, and including Chronicles, are written about a period in which the regime is settled and a monarchy is firmly established. Therefore, the political questions considered are only constitutional ones at times of crisis, most often focusing on the manner in which the monarchy functions within the constitutional framework to serve the principles of the covenant. Each book consists in the substance of a series of cases presented in roughly chronological sequence, but not designed to form a historical narrative as such. See, for example, the two accounts of the crossing of the Jordan in chapters 3 and 4. It includes a detailed presentation of the actual form of government to be used in the Israelite Commonwealth. In Joshua, the entire discussion is couched in rather precise technical, political, and geographical terminology. The narrative is centered around Joshua, a classic statesman, general endowed with the Lord's charisma, as the first minister. Joshua is divided into three major sections as follows. This is 1. The account of the conquest. 2. The division of the land. 3. Joshua's farewell addresses and concluding covenant. Each of these sections deals with a major constitutional question and its resolution in the context of the Israelite polity. For moderns, the Bible, like the American Western, is cast in the form of a popular morality play. The story itself has the tone of a quote-unquote Western, including quote-unquote they went that away. This 2:5 is the story of Rahab and the two spies. The quote-unquote Western and the archetypical American morality play follows the biblical pattern in its style and to some extent its purposes. Major problems in reading the book of Joshua. The very first problem of concerns is the time of the conquest and its character. In other words, the validity of the biblical account. The traditional viewpoint takes the biblical account at face value. The critical viewpoints are varied, but generally hold that the conquest was not a single movement, but a long series of sporadic efforts. You see the apparent contradictions between Joshua and the first chapter of Judges. Many also argue that not all tribes came into the land at the same time. Some suggest that certain tribes were already in the land before the conquest and even before the main body of the people left Egypt. The critics cite the biblical text to show that the Canaanites were not all destroyed, but that some were incorporated into the Israelite Commonwealth. I'll suggest that the biblical account is a later patchwork of different versions. Others, principally Yehiel Kaufman, suggest that the biblical account is largely accurate. Kaufman argues that a large contiguous area was conquered in one fell swoop, but pockets of unconquered territory were left for later, as described in Judges. This also explains how the Borders were extended by the individual tribes. Among Kaufman's arguments is that the Israelites invented their own form of government, the Edah, unlike anything in Canaan, and that the division of the land was so complete that the Bible does not record any intertribal conflicts over boundaries. Although it does mention intertribal problems in other spheres, it is not necessary to accept either view to appreciate the character of Joshua or to accept its place in the scheme of Israel's constitutional development as posited here. It is generally agreed that the oldest portions of Joshua are original documents of the time. It is also held that the book was compiled by the same prophetic scroll reflected in Deuteronomy. Joshua can be seen as their political commentary on the constitutional principles embodied in Deuteronomy. Biblical scholars estimate that this occurred no later than the 7th century BCE. This writer would suggest it occurred in the 11th century in the course of the struggle over the monarchy, which will be discussed further below. The Israelite migration, including the exodus from Egypt and conquest of Canaan, must be viewed as one of the great migrations of that era, which was an era of migrations and conquests in the eastern Mediterranean region. The four principal migrations and conquests involved, which is 1, the Israelites who overwhelmed Canaanite civilization, 2, the Dorians who overwhelmed Mycenaean civilizations in Greece, 3, the Achaeans, I'm sorry if I said it wrong, Sardinians and Lycaons who overwhelmed the Mediterranean islands, 4, the Philistines who overwhelmed the coastal peoples of Canaan. Thus, whatever occurred in Canaan at the time was not only unique in its result of the Jewish people, but part of a larger human phenomenon that initiated a great leap forward in Western and ultimately world civilization. The classic character of the book of Joshua fits well into that classic epoch. Recovery of its teachings is part of that recovery of the foundations of the classic Western civilization of Israel and Hellas. The immediate problems of the Israelite tribal confederacy. Our working hypothesis is that Joshua was first edited sometime in the 11th century BCE, at the height of the struggle between the Israelites and the Philistines. At the time of the book's appearance, the issue was probably still in doubt, and even more than that, it is likely that the Israelites had not yet found their leadership and organization necessary to win major victories against the well-organized and better armed Philistines. This was the period in which it had become apparent that the weak confederacy binding the tribes together was no longer adequate to the task of government at hand. Reliance on an impermanent national government of the period of the judges had led to national disaster. The problem facing the Israelites then was how best to reform the Confederacy's constitution. Joshua presents one solution to this problem. It is a progressive but essentially conservative solution, seeking not to change the Israelite constitution in new and untried ways, but to restore what its authors believed to be its original form. It is an essentially Republican solution designed to guarantee the continuation of limited popular government along with renewed national energy, based upon the continued distribution of powers between the tribe and on one hand and national authorities on the other. Its republicanism is particularly marked since it was developed as an answer to the monarchists who argued that the only solution to the problem of effective government was a centralized monarchy. It is possible to theorize that the prophet Samuel is speaking through this book, since the ideal system proposed in it is much like the system of Samuel tried but failed to institute during his judgeship, 1 Samuel 7-8. Joshua makes its argument in a most indirect way by describing a golden age of Israelite political and military successes at the beginning of Israel's dwelling in its land. It must do so because of the already sacred character of the text in hand that preserved record of the founding era. All the editors can do is arrange and slightly change, add to modify those texts so that they fit together. They feel compelled in their own minds to treat the text with piety, as well as to preserve the credibility of their argument. Thus the book implicitly evokes the great deeds of great ancestors in support of the editor's present claims, yet in a manner that allows those deeds to speak for themselves. The book makes Joshua the hero because he was the last leader of a totally unified federation for 2 centuries, and as such a model for those who sought tribal unity later. The author-editor of this book wants to show that a successful tribe federation did exist once, that the system of government constituted by Moses is a feasible one, even under conditions similar to those that have given rise to demands for a monarchy. According to the author, not only was the tribal federation successful in maintaining national unity, but it was successful in the face of the greatest national challenge, the conquest of the land. By implication, then it could be successful in coping with the current challenge of the Philistines. It's precisely in the military field that the successes of the federation must be demonstrated because of the military challenge confronting Israel in the author's day. By demonstrating that the confederal system was once viable, the author is also trying to project an image of the best government for the future. This best government is the United Israelite Federation, in which the tribes are strong, rooted in the land, within agrarian, economic-based, yet a government that possesses a federal authority built around a charismatic leader chosen by the people before God, and or vice versa, who has officers responsible to him as the national authority, and thus direct channels to the people, at least for military or national purposes, and all operating under God's covenant. It is to this end that Joshua is raised up as Moses' equal or near equal in this book. He is, first and foremost, a statesman prophet, who, unlike Moses, the lawgiver prophet, has spent his life in political and military roles, and whose forte is in the political realm. The crossing and river-splitting sequences, the historical site project, the mention of the 2.5 tribes, and the direct comparisons with Moses are all directed toward that end. This is the essence of Joshua's direct encounters with God in chapters 3 and 4, 1 through 14. There are two separate but interlocking lessons, as it were, that have to be brought out to set the stage for the author's ideas. The apparent chronological confusion in these chapters can be accounted for once it is recognized that what is of interest to the author is not the history per se, but its political implications. The larger problem of the good commonwealth. Beyond the immediate political crisis, the book is concerned with larger questions of building the holy commonwealth on earth. Consequently, any solution the authors might try to design would have to conform to their ideas of what a proper constitution should be. The explicit details of the governmental structure they propose were not necessarily considered by them to be ideal for all nations at all times. The biblical view, like that of the Greeks, is that different peoples need different constitutions or forms of government to meet their unique circumstances. Moreover, the Bible is general and more concerned with the relationship between governors and governed than with the form of regime. But it probably means two things. A, that this is the form of government best suited for Israel, and B, that the essential principles of the Constitution, sovereignty of God, federalism, republicanism, distribution of powers, and limited government, are necessary for any truly good commonwealth. The very inclusion of the book of Joshua in the Bible is one more bit of evidence to support this contention. If it had only been a political tract for the 11th century, it would have gone the way of the majority of the other books current in Israel at its time. It is because of its larger political significance that it was raised to the stature of a special book deserving inclusion in the canon. The importance of Joshua in Jewish rabbinic tradition is indicated in the fact that the book's first chapter is the Haftarah, prophetic portion, read every Sabbath morning at the conclusion of the Torah portion of the week. For Simchat's Torah, the festival commemorating the completion of the annual Torah reading cycle and its beginning anew, this can be understood as symbolizing the continuity of Jewish history and Torah study, which in political terms is a study of Israel's constitution and its application. General principles. According to the Bible, forms of government are not divinely ordained but human inventions. Hence, the people of Israel are free to institute arrangements suitable to their situation at any particular time, provided that God's sovereignty and covenant with them is recognized as a source of their fundamental law, and the Torah is maintained as their constitution. Thus, it is not the form of the regime that is crucial, but the relationship between governors and governed. While the teachings in Joshua also rest upon this principle, it does propose one form of regime as the best, linking the two elements through the principle that it must be instituted through a covenant between the people, the rulers, and God, or in God's presence. The essential problems of government, a more perfect union, domestic tranquility, and a common defense. Joshua suggests that the problems of national unity, internal order, and national defense will be solved through a proper federal republic embracing the entire nation. What is needed is a united tribal federation govern under a republican form of government with national leaders chosen on the basis of their relationship to God, but responsible to the people and most important to the law, and with tribal leaders retaining their essential roles under the new law or rule of law. Such a system is the basis for the ideal commonwealth in which power is shared by the national government and the tribes. Under such a system, God retains his sovereignty undiminished, but governs through appropriate human leadership. God, the governors, and the people are united through a covenant subsidiary to and derived from the Sinai covenant. Chapter 1 outlines the precise form of national political organizations, and chapters 23 to 24 discuss its purposes. The transcendent question of what constitutes political morality. It is hard to say whether the discussion of this question within the confines of the book of Joshua was purposive or not. In some cases, the discussion of what constitutes republican virtue. In some cases, it gives every indication of being purposive. In others, the moral lesson of the spies. In others, the issue is by no means clear. Still, a careful reading of the text reveals what can be understood to be a number of serious discussions of the great questions of political morality, perhaps placed purposely, perhaps simply unavoidable in any discussion of the great political questions confronting man. Some examples of the book concerns in this realm include: 1. The book emphasizes the idea of societies collapsing from within, out of moral weakness, and that we encounter in Scripture as early as the Noah story, to see the fall of Jericho, especially 2:9 through 10. And the second, honesty in maintaining the historic record is presented as a virtue. And you see the crossing the Jordan as a 4:6 through 8, the battle of Ai, 7:26, 8:29, 6:3. There are limitations on waging war, even the most justifiable wars, namely wars on national liberation. 4. Collective national responsibility is the key to political survival. 5. Government by covenant under the law is a sine qua non. Joshua's authority is established in the Keter Malchut. The first chapter of the book of Joshua is used to set the stage for the entire work. On the surface, it is developed to telling the story of Joshua's accession to leadership of the tribal confederacy, his acquisition of a mandate from God, who renews his promise and restates the conditions that must be met by the Israelites for its fulfillment, his order to the tribes to begin preparations for crossing the Jordan, and the renewal of the promise of the 2.5 Transjordanian tribes to participate in the conquest. The manner of telling the story, however, indicates a meaning beyond the simple recounting of history. Verses 1 through 9 serve as a general introduction to the entire work, covering God's charge to Joshua, effectively restating the terms of his covenant with Israel, including his repetition of the promise and its conditions. The statement and explication of the national motto, Hazak ve'ematz, be strong and courageous, and his restatement of the centrality of the Torah in the life of Israel. Verses 10 and 11 show Joshua giving his first commands to the nation through his officials. Verses 12 through 18 cover Joshua's reminder to the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh of their obligation to participate in the conquest, his instructions as to what they must do to prepare for their role, and their willing acquiescence based on their recognition of Joshua as Moses' legitimate successor. The chapter introduces certain key political terms already used in the Torah. First among them is Eved Adonai. See also Exodus 14:31, Numbers 12:7. Used in the book's very first verse as the title of the highest political and moral leader of the Israelite nation, who serves God the King, as his quote-unquote God's prime minister. The construction of the title implicitly recognizes the sovereignty of God and denies the legitimacy of vesting sovereignty in a human monarch. The Eved Adonai can be the head of the government of the Israelites, but only God can be the head of the state. In the book of Joshua, the term is used 15 times, 13 times in connection with Moses and twice in connection with Joshua. In the rest of the Bible, it is used only 5 times and in only 4 books: Deuteronomy, Judges, 2 Kings, 2 Chronicles. In all cases, it is used as a modifier for either Moses or Joshua. In other books, it is used 4 times in connection with Moses and once in connection with Joshua. In Deuteronomy and Judges, the term appears in immediate juxtaposition to the beginning and end of Joshua. In Joshua, where the emphasis is on identifying Joshua as Moses' legitimate and full successor, The term is used in connection with Moses until the very end of the book, where in the last chapters it is explicitly applied to Joshua as it had been inferentially earlier. During the history of the tribal federation presented in Judges, the only term used for national political leaders is shofet. Since the term Eved Adonai apparently did not enter common usage, one might ask whether it was accepted as an actual public title in the Edah. Perhaps it never even had such connotations outside the circle responsible for writing the Torah and the book of Joshua. At the same time, the internal evidence provided by the Bible indicates that in the years between Joshua and the inauguration of the monarchy, the only person who could possibly have been considered for the title was Samuel, the only shofet who was able to assert his leadership over the entire nation. It may be that awarding him this title is what is being implicitly suggested here. Continuationally, the term remains confined to the government of the classic Edah. When kingship is introduced, it is not used for the king, apparently quite deliberately. Saul, clearly designated by Samuel to play a more limited role than the Eved Adonai, was given the title Megid, best translated as High Commissioner. Even after David's ascension to the throne and consolidation of the kingship, the prophets continued to refer to him as his hearers by the same term, Megid. David's own court poets tried to introduce the title Eved Elohim, which has the same meaning as Eved Adonai, but uses a different term for God. They apply it to the new king in the book of Psalms, but were unsuccessful probably because the historic associations of the formal prophetic opposition. According to the Bible, only the people use the term Melech, king, which remained a colloquial title. 5 centuries later, the prophet Ezekiel, in his description of the messianic days of restoration to come, endorses the Davidi's governmental role, but carefully refers to quote-unquote king as Nazi, literally someone raised up or elected, perhaps best translated as magistrate or chief magistrate. Thus, after the failure of Samuel's reform effort, God ceased to directly rule the Edah, so there was no further need for Eved Adonai as a technical term, as it was abandoned. A second major constitutional principle is that there is to be no hereditary leadership outside of the priesthood. Each new leader must be chosen by God and be endowed with charisma by him. Not even Moses can designate his heir alone. Though Joshua is their heir apparent, he is not the legitimate leader of the nation until God speaks to him directly and passes the responsibility to him. This strong reliance on the role of the Lord and the rejection of inherited leadership per se is part of the pattern often referred to by Puritan divines in the 17th century as the quote-unquote Republican virtue of the Hebrew Bible, which is see also Exodus 24:13, Numbers 11:28. Joshua achieved leadership through his prior service to the nation. This is clear from the record in the Torah proper. See Exodus 17:9, Numbers 27:19, and Deuteronomy 1:28. The later sages apparently believed that this was to be a lesson for the people. In Bamidbar, Rabbah 12:9, the Talmudic commentary on Numbers it is related to that Moses wanted his sons to succeed him, to make the leadership hereditary, but God chose Joshua on the grounds of his lifelong faithful service and demonstrated ability. The principle of leadership by election rather than inheritance outside of the Keter Keuna has been the basis of the rule for the Jewish polity for most of its history. Even when the Davidites sat on the throne in Jerusalem, the large northern kingdom of Israel effectively rejected hereditary rule. Moreover, constitutionally, the people had a role. Even in the Davidic and Hasmonean dynasties, new kings went through at least a pro forma process of public acclamation and prophetic or priestly anointment to signify the laying on of God's charisma. In the prophetic commonwealth, all authority is from two sources, God and the people. Hence, Joshua has to have his authority affirmed by the people as well as by God for the Edah as a whole. What happens in the desert, as is recounted in the Torah itself, however, because of the conquest of much of Transjordan and the settlement of the 2.5 tribes in those lands under special conditions that required them to participate in the conquest of Canaan, even after they settled, he must establish his authority as Moses' successor over these tribes and get them to reaffirm their commitment. The 2.5 tribes are described as accepting Joshua's authority in the confrontation, reminiscent of the formal covenanting. Joshua gets his mandate from the Lord and then places it before the people, or a segment thereof, who pledges loyalty to him as long as the Lord is with him. He retains the divine charisma. This is clearly a political covenant in the sense that it affirms or legitimizes a power relationship by making it authoritative. As such, it is the first strictly political covenant of an internal character in the Bible, a renewal of the authority relationships established at Sinai. The frequent mention of the 2.5 tribes role is designed to show the unity of the tribal federation in those days, as if to say, quote, "See, even the 2.5 tribes that settled east of the Jordan fulfilled their part of the agreement with Moses and sent men to help in the conquest of the land," end quote. This can be read as another indication that the book was written in a period when tribal unity was a problem. Once God's chief minister is entrusted with leadership, in the case of Joshua, by Moses before the latter's death, God is able to give him a direct mandate. God is explicit regarding the content of that mandate, including the task of conquering the land. Thus, a third constitutional principle having to do with the Israelites' right to Canaan is introduced. Already in verse 4, we have another review of the classic boundaries of the promise. Compare it to the promises of Genesis 15:18, Exodus 23, 3-12, Numbers 24, 3-12, and Deuteronomy 11:24. God's mandate continues with regard to Joshua's relationship to him. He concludes by reaffirming the motto he has bestowed on the Edah and its leadership. This is, quote, "Strengthen your character and make yourself courageous," end quote, which is repeated 3 times in the course of this conversation. It is a statement of classic strength which all of the ancients believed to be essential to the citizens of republics. Yet God never lets his people forget that they are bound by their Torah, constitution, and are under his judgment. He concludes his mandate to Joshua with a combined blessing warning with regarding the learning the Torah as a constitutional teaching and living up to the requirements, or else. Here is the opening of the prophetic vision of why the full promise never came to pass: Israel's sin, the abandonment of Torah. The term for a second office of the Edah, Shotrei Ham, officers of the people. They introduce in verse 10 the Shotrim, were the lesser officials of the national government, those entrusted with executing the policies of the Eved Adonai and the Shofetim. Note, however, that they are referred to as officers of the people, in modern terminology, public servants, not officials of the national government or its leadership. The word shoter is from the terminological complex meaning, quote, order, end quote, and is related to such terms as mishtar, political order or system, and shitar, contract. In modern Hebrew, the term means policeman, a recognition of its kingship with the English terminological complex meaning, quote-unquote, order, in the same sense as policy, political, and police, and the original meaning of order. The term is one of the oldest in the Hebrew political lexicon. The Torah refers to Shotrim as officers of the people during Egyptian bondage. Thus, the chapter concludes after having outlined the basis of the classic biblical polity, and with its king terms and relationships in place. Chapter 2, which deals with Rahab and the spies in Jericho, offers a stark and deliberate contrast to chapter 1. The whole chapter is presented in a simplified story from characteristic of such biblical narratives. Behind the story, however, is a contrast between the Edah as a polity and the political systems of Canaan. This contrast is particularly important in light of the people's revolutionary demand in the 11th century BCE for a king, just quote-unquote, like all the nations. Canaan was divided into city-states, which, with its own ruler, referred to in the text as a melech, or a king. Scholars argue that the meaning of kingship in Canaan, but even if not a quote-unquote king, in the sense of a powerful monarch, it is generally agreed that they were constitutional monarchs in the sense that they were responsible to, or at least limited by local assemblies, either popular or notables, or both. The biblical reference to all Canaanite rulers as quote-unquote kings may be considered a shorthand generalization, not a reflection of Israelite ignorance of the subtleties of the Canaanite political framework. Joshua actually identifies 4 forms of formal leadership among the nations with which Israel came in contact. The first is the melech, or king, common for Canaanite cities. The second, the ziknim, of the Gibeonites. Third is the Saranim, officers of the Philistines. And fourth, the Nisim, of the Midianites. Each term is used in a specific technical sense, reflecting, as each does, a different form of government.